In 1970, over half the men in Britain smoked cigarettes and nearly half the women did too. This wasn't some fringe habit, it was completely normal. You could smoke just about anywhere, on the bus, on the train, in the cinema, in restaurants, in your office, at work, even in hospitals. The doctor examining you might well have a lit cigarette burning in the ashtray on his desk while he asked about your cough. Nobody thought twice about it. If you walked into a pub on a Saturday night, the air would hit you like fog. Thick blue-grey smoke hung everywhere. Your eyes would water. The smell clung to your clothes and hair for days after. Office workers had glass ashtrays stamped with government property on their desks. Teachers smoked in the staff room, and their tweed jackets reeked of stale smoke. People lit up in meetings, in waiting rooms, on aeroplanes. A non-smoker had no real way to escape it unless they stayed home. The smoking itself followed rituals. In pubs, people would offer their cigarettes around before lighting their own. It was considered polite, a mark of good hospitality. Smokers warned children it was a filthy habit, but kept on doing it anyway. Do as I say, not as I do. The thing is, most people genuinely didn't grasp how dangerous it was yet, even though the medical evidence had been building since the 50s. Smoking was sophisticated. Hollywood stars made it look glamorous. The cigarette packets themselves were beautifully designed, the Player's Sailor, the Senior Service Ship, the elegant black and gold of John Player's Special. They sat on coffee tables like ornaments. Before the 1970s, most people driving cars simply didn't wear seatbelts. Not because they forgot or couldn't be bothered, but because it genuinely wasn't seen as necessary. You'd hop in a car with your mates. Kids would pile into the back seat without any restraints whatsoever, and everyone just carried on like nothing could possibly go wrong. It was normal to see children standing between the front seats or even sitting in the driver's lap on long journeys. If you were in an accident, you were in an accident. That was just the risk you accepted when you got behind the wheel. The cars themselves were massive metal boxes designed to survive anything, but all that crash force went straight into the people inside. Drivers and passengers bounced around the interior like pinballs when things went wrong. Nash started offering seatbelts as optional equipment in 1914, but the public response was so poor that people were actually cutting them out of their cars. They saw belts as uncomfortable, restrictive, and frankly insulting. The thinking went that if you were a good driver, you didn't need a belt. Accidents happened to other people, reckless people. When some states tried to make belts mandatory in government vehicles during the 1960s, there was genuine outrage about personal freedom being taken away. Even when front seat passengers were legally required to buckle up in 1994 in some places, plenty of drivers just ignored it. The idea that you might need protecting inside your own car felt absurd to many people. Looking back now, it seems absolutely mad, but that's how it was. In British schools during the 70s, getting hit by a teacher wasn't some rare scandal. It was just how things worked. Most schools had a cane or a strap, and head teachers kept them in their offices like any other piece of equipment. The cane was usually about a yard long, made of rattan or bamboo, thin enough to whistle through the air, but solid enough to sting like hell. The strap, which some places called the tawse, was 3 or 4 strips of thick leather sewn together, sometimes with the ends split into tongues. In places like Newcastle, they even standardized it, sending straps out to schools through the post. The new model in 1976 was 20 inches long, nearly 2 inches wide, designed to be a proper deterrent. Teachers used these things for all kinds of offences: talking in class, forgetting your homework, wearing the wrong socks. Kids got whacked on the hand, palm up, or told to bend over for strokes across the backside. At grammar schools, the headmaster would read out names at Monday assembly, and those boys knew they were getting caned later that day. The justification was always the same, without the threat of physical punishment. How could you maintain discipline? Teachers genuinely believed this was necessary, that children needed the fear to behave. Even parents signed consent forms allowing schools to beat their kids. For pupils, it created this constant background dread. You might never actually get hit, but the possibility hung over everything. In the 70s, British kids were out the door by 8 or 9 in the morning and weren't expected back until tea time. That was normal. Parents would literally tell you to go outside and play, And the only real rules were don't talk to strangers and be home when the streetlights came on. You'd disappear for hours with your mates, roaming the local streets, climbing trees, building dens in the woods, or mucking about on wasteland left over from the war. Nobody had a mobile phone. Nobody could track where you were. Your parents had no idea what you were doing for most of the day, and that was considered perfectly fine. If you fell out of a tree or scraped your knee, you'd dust yourself off and carry on. You only went home if you were properly hurt or needed something to eat. The freedom was absolute. Kids would bike miles away from home, play by rivers, explore abandoned buildings, or just wander around the neighborhood making up games. Studies done later showed that children in the 1970s had roughly 9 times more roaming territory than their own kids would have by the 90s. Back then, 80% of 7 and 8-year-olds walked to school alone. By 1980, that had dropped to 10%. But in the 70s, this kind of independence was seen as healthy. It taught you to solve your own problems, handle conflicts with other kids without running to an adult, and figure out how far you could push things before something went properly wrong. Parents weren't hovering, they were mostly just getting on with their own lives and trusting you not to do anything catastrophically stupid. For most of the 20th century, lead was absolutely everywhere. It was in the petrol you put in your car, the paint on your walls, the pipes carrying water to your kitchen tap, and even in the glazes on your dinner plates. This wasn't some accident or oversight, people genuinely thought it was fine. If you wanted to freshen up a nursery or a child's bedroom, you'd likely grab a tin of lead-based paint without a second thought. The layer you put on the walls would contain substantial amounts of the metal, and when that paint eventually aged and started to peel, or when you sanded it during renovations, lead dust would fill the air. Every time someone drove a car, tiny lead particles sprayed out of the exhaust and settled on soil, dust, and anything nearby. Children played on contaminated ground, tracked the dust indoors on their shoes, and put their hands in their mouths. Houses built before the 1970s often had lead pipes or lead solder connecting copper pipes, which meant drinking water could pick up lead as it flowed through the system to your tap. Ceramic glazes contained lead compounds. Car batteries were made with lead plates. Some toys and cribs were painted with lead-based finishes, which meant children could literally chew on lead. For decades, this level of exposure was simply considered normal, and people assumed that if lead was in so many products, it must be safe. The notion that something so common could be poisoning everyone slowly just didn't register. For most of the 20th century, children and pubs coexisted in ways that would surprise people today. Until 1995, kids under 14 couldn't legally enter licensed premises in England and Wales, but that didn't mean they weren't around. On weekday evenings and weekends, the pavements outside industrial area pubs were full of children playing hopscotch, kicking balls about, or just waiting. Their parents were inside having a pint or two, and if you were a working-class family without money for a babysitter, the pavement became your childcare solution. Mum would pop her head out occasionally to check on you, then disappear back inside. You could hear the noise spilling out, voices, laughter, sometimes singing, but the frosted windows meant you couldn't see in. Some landlords set up waiting rooms to keep the kids out of the cold and rain, though these were often dingy spaces with torn furniture. In Crawley, Newtown in the 1950s, planners even mandated that new pubs include so-called kiddie bars where children could have ice cream and orange squash. When the rules finally loosened in 1995 to allow children into pubs for family dining, it wasn't some radical new idea. It was actually Britain catching up with continental Europe, where kids had always been welcome in cafes and eating establishments. The looser boundaries made sense if you lived in a pub, which many publicans' families did. Children grew up in these spaces, with bedrooms tucked above the bar, running around the private quarters while parents worked downstairs. The smell of stale beer, the sound of glasses clinking, the rough laughter from the saloon, that was just normal life. Some pubs designated special rooms as family areas, separate lounges where women and children could sit away from the men-only saloon bar. The boundaries were there, but everyone quietly accepted them. Playgrounds became common in urban areas around the early 1900s, built with the idea that outdoor play would create strong, healthy children. The equipment was remarkably simple and brutally unforgiving. Jungle gyms were massive steel structures that could easily reach 20 feet in the air, essentially towers of metal bars with nothing underneath but dirt, grass, or actual concrete. Kids would climb to the top, hang upside down by their knees, and scramble across thin rungs while suspended over hard ground. Most survived the experience with just scrapes and bruises, but falling from the top meant hitting every bar on the way down. The ground surface wasn't there to cushion anything, it was just whatever happened to be there already. Slides were scorching metal sheets that could hit temperatures above 160 degrees on a summer day. You either accepted the thigh burns or you didn't go down at all. Wooden versions offered splinters instead of burns, so really you just picked your pain. The spinning rides, like merry-go-rounds, were powered by kids running alongside and jumping on, reaching speeds that would fling other children off like projectiles if they lost their grip. Swings hung from tall frames on thick chains, launching you high enough to see over the entire park. The hard ground waited below if you mistimed your jump from the peak. Seesaws were heavy wooden planks that could slam you into the dirt if the kid on the other end decided to hop off mid-ride. There were no safety rails, no rubber mats, no regulations about fall zones or maximum heights. Injuries were simply accepted as part of learning. A broken arm during summer was basically a badge of honor rather than grounds for a lawsuit. Until the late 1960s, if you opened a newspaper and flipped to the back looking for work, you'd find the job listings neatly divided into two sections: help wanted male and help wanted female. This wasn't some subtle suggestion either. The headings were printed right there at the top of the columns in bold type, telling you exactly which jobs were meant for you based on nothing but your sex. The male section offered everything from management trainee positions to engineering roles to airline careers with starting salaries described as among the best in the industry. Men were promised opportunity and advancement. The female section, by contrast, was packed with ads for typists, clerks, receptionists, and something called a Gal Friday, which basically meant doing whatever odd jobs your boss needed. One ad actually promised that occasional overtime at time and a half will help fill your piggy bank, as if women were children saving up pocket money rather than adults trying to earn a living. When the same job title appeared in both sections, women were routinely offered lower pay. A Fargo accounting firm in 1971 advertised for male accountants at $9,000 per year to supervise staff, whilst female accountants with identical qualifications were offered $8,000 and no supervisory role. Ads targeting female applicants often included requirements about appearance. You needed to be attractive, well-groomed, sometimes within specific height and weight ranges. Airline stewardess ads were particularly blunt. Single women only, aged 21 to 26, height between 5'3" and 5'8", weight between 105 and 138 pounds, and absolutely no glasses or contact lenses. The message was unmistakable. Your physical appeal mattered as much as your ability to do the job, maybe more. This practice was completely legal and utterly ordinary. The New York Times did it, every major newspaper in America did it, right there in black and white for everyone to see. In December 1973, Britain's Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath announced something unprecedented. From the 1st of January, businesses could only use electricity on 3 specified consecutive days each week. This wasn't some planned modernization scheme. This was an emergency measure forced by a coal miners' overtime ban that was strangling the nation's power supply. Most of the UK's electricity came from coal-burning stations at the time, and with miners refusing overtime in a pay dispute, coal stocks were dwindling fast. Rather than face a complete shutdown, the government chose to ration working time to stretch out the fuel they had left. Commercial users got their 3 days and were banned from working longer hours on those days to make up for it. Essential services like hospitals and supermarkets were exempt, but ordinary factories and offices had to pick their days and stick to them. Television broadcasting had to cease at 20:30 each evening to save electricity. Though this requirement was dropped after Heath called an election in February, most pubs shut down. Domestic power was rationed too, with households facing disconnections for hours at a stretch. People stocked up on candles, paraffin heaters, anything that didn't need the grid. When miners voted overwhelmingly to strike in late January, Heath gambled on an election with the slogan, "Who governs Britain?" thinking voters would back him against union power. They didn't. Labour won the most seats, formed a government, and ended the three-day week on the 7th of March 1974. If you wanted to make a phone call in the 1940s and 1950s, and you were like most people, you didn't have a phone at home, you had to find a public call box. In Britain, these were the bright red boxes on street corners and outside village shops. In Australia and elsewhere, they were wooden booths in stations or wall-mounted phones in pubs. Finding a phone box didn't mean you could use it straight away, though. Someone might already be in there and you'd have to wait your turn. Queues formed especially during peak times when everyone wanted to phone home after work. You could see people waiting outside even when the box was empty, and this was because they were waiting for an incoming call. Public phone boxes had their own numbers, so people arranged to ring each other at specific times. You'd tell someone, "Ring me at 6 at the box on High Street," then stand outside waiting to hear it ring. If you were inside trying to have a private conversation while a queue built up, people would tap on the glass. Some would bang on the window if they thought you'd been going on too long. It made phone calls stressful and brief, especially when the matter was personal or complicated. In rural areas, there might be only one phone box for miles around, shared between entire villages. Women especially depended on these phones for organizing children's activities and keeping in touch with family. Getting the right coins for the slots was a constant worry because without correct change, you couldn't call at all. This meant planning your life around access to communication, not the other way round.